and welcome back to Philosophy 371, 473, or 671, depending on which university you're at. So in the first lecture, I talked a little bit about how complaining about classical logic might motivate us to adopt a non-classical logic. So we talked about some features of classical logic that you might find problematic or unintuitive, and how wanting to revise some of those features might lead you to adopt a non-classical system of some kind. And today, we're actually going to complain about something different, something which in some ways is easier to complain about, which is racism. And we're actually going to talk about what's sometimes referred to as structural racism. So that's different from, say, somebody having, like a particular person having individual racist beliefs like negative stereotypes or something along those lines. This is what is sometimes thought of as kind of racist policies or things that are embedded in institutions. And it turns out that when we study logic, we're actually really well equipped to think about systems and structures. So let's see how this might actually play out. Okay, so when I talk about an institution, that's a pretty abstract term, but something like a university is an institution. The justice system in Canada is an institution. Policing is an institution. And so these are systems. There's rules, there's procedures, different people have different kinds of roles to play. And they're harder to understand, I think, than most formal systems where all the rules are made super explicit and you can just define everything. Their formal systems are quite transparent, where institutions tend to be less transparent. But you might find that yourself actually thinking about them in similar sorts of terms. And in formal systems, you have trade-offs. So in formal systems, you have trade-offs between expressive power and complexity. You might think of analogous trade-offs in institutions. So you might find trade-offs between, say, inclusiveness, so making sure the institution works for everybody that it might be intended to serve, and simplicity. So just to take a couple of examples from academic institutions, one example might be strict deadlines. So if I tell you that your assignment absolutely has to be handed in on Friday at 5 p.m., then you do that, and then I can post the answer key to your problem set at 5:01 p.m. So everyone knows exactly what to expect. But of course, lots of us who have been through school and had assignments with deadlines have had trouble meeting those deadlines. Sometimes something comes up, sometimes you're sick, sometimes that deadline just doesn't work out for all kinds of reasons. And so that kind of simple deadline, you know exactly when you need to turn it in, here's when the answer key gets posted, for lots of our benefit, doesn't necessarily work for all those kinds of extenuating circumstances. So inclusiveness, meaning everyone who is capable of doing the work gets to turn their assignment in and get credit for it, like that's a good thing. But also having a straightforward set of rules, that's also a good thing. So when you're coming up with, say, a syllabus policy, so something to put on your course outlines, you'll find yourself balancing those kinds of trade-offs. Simple requirements for a philosophy major. So some of you watching this are probably philosophy majors or might be thinking about it. You might find a set of really straightforward requirements. You have to take this class in logic, this class in the history of philosophy, this class in the philosophy of science or philosophy of mind, and it might be really straightforward. But on the other hand, there's lots of areas in philosophy that aren't really covered in a lot of our departments. So for example, UVic almost exclusively offers classes in philosophy that come from relatively narrow geographical regions. So we kind of exclude entire continents from our coverage. And if we want to be more inclusive, I mean, I'm in favor of that, but that makes our requirements, that makes our institution a little bit more complicated. So again, we have to figure out where we want to be in that kind of balance. Okay, so now these are some of the trade-offs that happen within institutions. These are some of the kinds of decisions that people who run institutions end up having to make. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about philosophy, at least in Canada. So I teach philosophy in Canada. you're studying philosophy in Canada. So let's talk about the history of logic. So I studied logic when I was a student. I teach it now. And so where did logic, as we currently study it, originate? Well, if you think about the history that you might have been told, I'm not sure. You might have seen it traced back to Aristotle and syllogistic logic through the kind of medieval period and a bunch of the scholastics. And then it sort of ends up somehow in Frege. And then you basically have the quantified logic that we have now. So one question that you might ask yourself is why that history, which tends to be thought of as a kind of history of Western philosophy. So this is a history of logic in Western philosophy. So why is that the history of logic that we just kind of casually get in our background instead of Mozi or Nagarjuna? So just to pick a couple of examples of people who were also, maybe in this period that we might call ancient philosophy, but in very different parts of the world. So in China or India. Okay, so those are just a couple of examples that I have heard of philosophical traditions where there's a strong emphasis on argumentation and logic. So why don't we have them in our histories of logic? And it turns out that, part of what happens in our institutions of academic philosophy is we end up telling relatively simple histories of our discipline, and this ends up sacrificing inclusiveness. Okay, so what that means is that when I get taught about the history of logic, or when somebody tells me about the history of logic, I get a kind of standard history of logic. It goes through people who look more like Richard than like me. And, fine, that's a history of logic, but you might wonder why that is the history of logic that we get here. Okay. History of philosophy as well. This is what I've described is kind of a general thing for the history of philosophy. Lots of you have had to take history of philosophy courses, and lots of philosophers we read and assign regularly said lots of racist things, supported colonialism. Hume, Kant, Locke, you can find all of these things in the things that they wrote. But they're regularly required for a philosophy major. So we end up having to read people who said these kinds of things, who had these kinds of views. Okay, fine. But what kinds of philosophical ideas did people have in relation to the territories that we live on? So for example, we can read, we can read Locke if we want to, saying why colonialism is actually perfectly well justified. But what about the people whose lands were taken? What kinds of philosophical ideas did they have that we can actually could actually learn about, that we could benefit from engaging with, that might actually have to do with the places, their territory that we're actually living on? So why don't we know more about their ideas through our regular academic channels? So these are some questions that you might ask yourself. So there is a little bit about academia as an institution, but of course there's other institutions. One obvious one that gets talked about a lot when we talk about anti-racism is this thing called the school to prison pipeline. So what connects academia to some other institutions is the fact that not everyone is treated equally in our K-12 education. So not everyone is treated as somebody who should be supported in the same kinds of ways. Some people get disciplined more than others, get more opportunities than others, all these kinds of things. So the school to prison pipeline is the name that's sometimes given to a process of pushing, so particularly Black and Indigenous kids, but not exclusively and not all, but it tends to push Black and Indigenous kids out of school and into the prison system, say, starting with juvenile detention, and then basically ending up with long periods of time incarcerated. So a lot of times this process starts in K-12 education. Okay, so this is just one of the ways in which our institutions in Canada tend to function. So, I mean, when it comes to incarceration, like we have statistics. So, StatsCan can tell us that not very long ago, like a few years ago, about 27% of people in federal prison are Indigenous, where Indigenous people are only about 5% of the population, and this varies from region to region. I think in the prairie regions, it's about 50% of the federally incarcerated population. So 50% of men in federal prison in the prairies are Indigenous, and it's something like 62% of women in the federal prison system. And again, that's hugely out of proportion to the numbers of Indigenous people in the Canadian population. The numbers are a little bit different for Black folks in Canada. There's fewer Black folks in Canada than there are Indigenous folks, according to StatsCan. There's about 8% of federal prison, of people in federal prison who are Black. So one of the things that we can know just from these numbers is that we can look at the output of our systems, and we can say that our justice system disproportionately incarcerates Black and Indigenous people. And one thing that we can think about if we are interested in thinking about systems is how it comes to do that. So how does that outcome of our system end up happening? And then we end up with an important question, right? So if, we hopefully think that this is an undesirable outcome, that we shouldn't be doing this. And then we think, okay, how do we change institutions? So what can we do? And just as we talked about two different kinds of responses to changing formal systems, so these are systems with much more transparent structures, like I said, much more transparent definitions, but you might still think of these kinds of responses in relation to social institutions. So our two responses were roughly reforming institutions. So these are things, so this was analogous to, say, extending classical logic. So we kind of largely keep what was already there, but then we might just extend it with something or improve on it in some kind of way, while leaving the background mechanisms mainly untouched. But there's also replacing institutions. So this is what we talked about when we talked about alternatives to classical logic, so replacing them with something different. And so what does that kind of thinking give us when we think about social institutions? So if we think about reform, so improving on institutions, so there we might think of approaches that improve on our academic or our carceral institutions. So those are the only two institutions that I've talked about. You are totally welcome to think about others, but those are just two that I happen to know a few things about. So for an academic institution, you might think about ways, a reform approach might be ways to diversify syllabi, diversify the representation of people who we read, diversify your faculty. So, improving diversity within academia, for example, that would be a kind of reform approach. With respect to a carceral system, there's a place where you might say, advocate for more anti-racism, more anti-bias training for police and correctional staff. So those are different kinds of reform solutions. And you might think about whatever problems you might have with the ways in which those institutions function, and think about whether these reform solutions would actually meet your concerns. You could have things like rehabilitative or counseling programs for people who are currently incarcerated, so as to reduce the rates of recidivism. So that's the kind of likelihood that they will end up being incarcerated again. So it turns out that a lot of people, once they've been incarcerated once, will end up being incarcerated again and again. So you could try and work on reforms to cut that off, so to stop them from becoming incarcerated again. But you might think about alternatives to institutions altogether. So this is like replacing classical logic with something totally different. So you might reject and replace the institutions we already have. You might think about what better alternatives might be. So in academia, you might overhaul a discipline's major requirements. You might totally change what is required to get a major in philosophy. You might even want to get rid of some of the disciplinary boundaries or all of the disciplinary boundaries. You might not think that we live in a time where there should even be clear distinctions between different kinds of academic disciplines. That would be a replacement kind of solution for the academic institution. You might have heard of calls to defund the police. In lots of cases, this is advocating a replacement solution. So a lot of people, when they say defund the police, mean kind of gradually reduce the amount of funding you give the police and channel it to other kinds of support. So channel that money to public health supports, other kinds of programs. So channel them towards programs that would make the police, to some extent, obsolete, right? So replace policing with a range of other things. So not with the same system, but maybe with a range of other systems. So something that looks really different. It might have some features in common. So, classical and many valued logics will probably each have a true truth value and a false truth value. So, whatever you replace policing with might have some features in common with our current police system. But the point is that it would be a different system and it would work in a really different kind of way. Similar kinds of considerations go to abolishing prisons. So abolishing prisons would mean replacing the current prison system with another kind of approach to justice, right? So it might, so instead of something like a retributive justice system where we think that somebody did something wrong and they should get punished, you might think of something more like a restorative justice system where somebody does something wrong and they need to make amends for it. They need to make up for it. So they need to somehow do something to make it better. And that's not the prison system we have now. It would be a different kind of system. All right. So the main idea is that the kinds of things that we think about when we're thinking about logical systems, and the benefit right now of being able to think about formal systems is that, again, they're really transparent. So you can say, this feature of classical logic bothers me. So here's how I might want to change it. Here's what I can envision as a different way to change, as a different way to do it, right? A different way to have a conditional symbol. And this kind of thinking is much harder to do when it comes to things like social institutions, because we don't always know all the rules. Some of the rules are unwritten. It's hard to figure out all the different moving parts, right? They're just not as neatly defined. But you might still think that some of the modes of thinking that you're developing when you're thinking about logical systems might also help you think about social structures or social institutions that you might want to reform or replace. So if you are bothered by an institution, try thinking structurally about it. So try thinking about how it works as a system, right? So turn on that, maybe try turning on that logician's part of your brain and try turning that towards the system that you think is a problem, and think about how you might analyze it and what you might want to do about it.